Margaret stood in the rusted yard on a cold morning, her breath making white clouds in the air. The old locomotive loomed above her, a massive machine of steel and iron that had not moved for 30 years. Paint peeled off its sides in long strips. The metal was orange with rust. Dirt and dead leaves covered the tracks beneath it. She was 58 years old, and everyone in Riverfield thought she had lost her mind. Her brother, Kevin, had laughed the hardest when she told him what she planned to do. He had laughed so hard he had to sit down. Kevin was 62 and worked as an accountant. He understood numbers, not dreams. When Margaret said she was using all her savings to buy this broken locomotive, Kevin shook his head and told her she was wasting her money on garbage. The neighbors had talked too. Margaret heard them when she went to the store. They whispered when they saw her coming. They said the retired engineer had finally cracked. They said she should be enjoying her retirement, traveling or sitting at home, not buying old scrap metal. The local news station sent a reporter out. He was young, maybe 30, with a camera and a big smile. He asked her on camera why she wanted an old locomotive. Margaret told him she saw potential. The reporter laughed. He did a story called "Retired Engineer Buys Junk Locomotive." The headline in the newspaper the next day read, "Is this woman crazy?" But Margaret did not care what they thought. She had spent 40 years designing engines for spacecraft. She had worked for the biggest space companies in the world. She had helped design engines that took humans to the moon, to Mars, and beyond. She understood machines in a way that most people could never understand them. Margaret ran her hand along the boiler of the locomotive. The metal was cold and rough. She could feel the history in it. She could feel what it had been. More than that, she could feel what it could become. 3 months ago, the Krell had arrived. Nobody expected it. The ships appeared in orbit above Earth on a Tuesday morning. They were massive, beautiful, made of materials that humans could not even identify. The Krell came in peace. They wanted to trade. They wanted to learn about human civilization. They wanted to see what humans had to offer the galaxy. The world had gone crazy with excitement. Governments sent diplomats. Scientists wanted to study Krell technology. Everyone wanted to know everything about these aliens who had come from so far away. But Margaret had watched the news and understood something that others did not. The Krell were polite, but they were not impressed. They looked at human cities and human technology the way a parent might look at a child's drawing. It was nice, maybe, but it was not serious. It was not real. The Krell had ships that could travel faster than light. They had technology that made human science look like ancient history. They had been exploring space for thousands of years, while humans had only begun in the last few decades. They did not say humans were primitive, but everyone could feel it in how they talked. Everyone could see it in how they moved. The Krell thought humans were not important. This made Margaret angry in a way that surprised her. She had spent 4 decades working with machines, understanding them, fixing them, improving them. She knew that the greatest strength of humans was not their size or their strength. It was not their intelligence, though humans were intelligent. The greatest strength of humans was their ability to look at something broken and make it work again. It was their ability to refuse to accept that something was impossible. Margaret believed that humans could do something the Krell could not do. She believed that humans could take the old and make it new. They could take failure and turn it into success. They could look at a problem and find a solution that nobody else had thought of. That was what humans did. That was what had always made humans special. When she heard that the Krell were coming to Earth to see what humans could offer, Margaret made a decision. She would show them. She would take this old, useless locomotive and turn it into something impossible. She would prove that humans were not just primitive children with better toys. She would prove that humans had something the Krell needed. That was why she had bought this locomotive. The first day she worked on it, she did not do much. She had just looked it over, understanding its systems, making notes in a worn notebook. She had designed spacecraft engines, yes, but this was different. This was mechanical. This was old technology. This was a challenge that made her feel alive in a way she had not felt in years. Her neighbor, Harold, came by with his dog. He looked at Margaret working on the locomotive and shook his head. He told her she was wasting her time. He said she should sell it for scrap and donate the money to charity. Harold meant well, Margaret knew. But Harold did not understand. Harold could not see what Margaret saw. That night, Margaret sat in her small house and made a plan. She wrote down everything she needed to do. She wrote down the parts she would need. She wrote down the systems she would change. She wrote down the timeline. It would take months of work. It would take knowledge she had not used in years. It would take money she did not have much of anymore. But Margaret had always been someone who did hard things. She had worked her way through college while other students studied. She had been one of the only women in her engineering programs when she was young. She had fought for respect in an industry that did not want to give it to women. She had worked 12-hour days designing engines that changed the world. She had never given up when things were hard. This locomotive was not harder than those things. It was just different. The next morning, Margaret started making calls. She called old colleagues who had retired. She called salvage companies. She called engineers she had worked with decades before. Some of them thought she was strange. Some of them asked what she was doing. But when she explained her plan, some of them understood. They understood because they were engineers too. They understood because they had spent their lives looking at problems and finding solutions. One old colleague, a man named Robert, who had worked with her at the space company, said he would help. He said he thought her idea was brilliant. He said he would send her some materials she needed. He said he wanted to see what she would make. Margaret felt grateful to Robert. She felt grateful that someone believed in her. The sun was setting as Margaret stood beside the locomotive that day. The yard was empty. The locomotive was silent. But in her mind, she could hear it. She could hear it running, could hear the power in its engine, could feel the strength of it moving down the tracks. Everyone had laughed when she bought it. But Margaret had never cared about being laughed at before. She had spent her whole life doing things people said were impossible. She had helped build machines that flew to other worlds. She had shown the world what was possible when you refused to accept that something could not be done. This locomotive would be no different. She would take this broken, useless machine. She would rebuild it. She would improve it. She would transform it into something that would prove to the Crow and to the world that human beings were not primitive. Human beings were adaptable. Human beings were creative. Human beings could take the old and make it new. And when the Crow saw what she had made, they would understand. They would finally understand that humans were not just young children in a galactic family. Humans were something special. Humans were something the galaxy needed. 6 months passed. The seasons changed from autumn to winter to spring. Margaret worked almost every day, sometimes through the night. The yard where the locomotive sat became her home. She started by taking the engine apart completely. Every bolt, every gear, every pipe. She laid everything out on clean tarps and made careful notes about where each piece belonged. The work was hard on her hands and her back, but she did not stop. She worked methodically, like she had always worked, with patience and precision. As she disassembled the locomotive, she understood its design. It had been built in 1932. The design was good but old. The materials were heavy. The systems were inefficient by modern standards. But the basic engineering was sound. This was something she appreciated. The engineers who had built it knew what they were doing. Once she had everything taken apart, she did something different. She did not just clean it and put it back together. Instead, she began to redesign it. Robert, her old colleague, sent her boxes of materials. Advanced alloys developed for space travel. Materials that were lighter than steel, but stronger. Materials that could handle heat better. Materials that most people had never even heard of. He also sent her technical documents, specifications, information about systems she could use. Margaret worked at a large table in a garage she had rented near the yard. She designed new systems on paper. She calculated measurements. She worked through the physics and the engineering. She thought about how the old locomotive could be transformed into something that combined the best of old technology with the best of new technology. She brought in a younger engineer named Carlos to help her. Carlos was 35 and worked at a local manufacturing company. Margaret had known his father, who had also been an engineer. She had heard Carlos was good. When she called him and explained what she wanted to do, Carlos said yes immediately. He said he thought it was the most interesting project he had ever heard of. Carlos brought tools and skills that Margaret needed. He helped her rebuild the boiler. He helped her install new systems. Together they worked late into the evenings and on weekends. Carlos's wife brought them food sometimes. They would eat in the garage and talk about engineering and about what they were making. "Why are we doing this?" Carlos asked once, eating a sandwich Margaret had made. Margaret looked at him. "Because the Krell need to understand that humans are not primitive," she said. "Because the world needs to understand it too. Because I believe it is true." The townspeople continued to mock her. Kevin brought friends by to watch his crazy sister work on garbage. The local newspaper did a follow-up story. This time, the headline asked, "Is this woman delusional?" Margaret did not read the newspaper. She worked. She rewired the electrical systems completely. She installed modern batteries that could store power. She created a hybrid system that combined traditional steam power with modern battery technology. It was not something anyone had ever done before with a locomotive. Most engineers would have said it was impossible. The system seemed too different, too contradictory. But Margaret knew that sometimes contradictions could work together if you understood them deeply enough. The old and the new could combine. The traditional and the modern could become one system if you designed it correctly. By month 3, the boiler was rebuilt with the new materials. By month 4, the electrical system was installed and tested. By month 5, she had rebuilt the engine itself, making it more efficient, making it more powerful, making it capable of things no traditional locomotive could do. Carlos worked with her through all of it. He learned from Margaret. He watched how she solved problems, how she thought about challenges, how she refused to accept that something could not be done. At night, he told his wife that Margaret was the best engineer he had ever met. He said he felt like he was studying with a master. The final month was the hardest. Margaret had to put it all together. She had to make sure all the new systems worked with each other. She had to test everything carefully. She had to make sure nothing would break or fail. She brought in an electrician named David to help with the final electrical work. David was a quiet man who did not ask questions. He just worked and did what Margaret told him to do. He understood that something important was happening, even if he did not understand exactly what it was. On a cold morning in late spring, Margaret and Carlos and David stood in the yard beside the locomotive. It was different now. The exterior had been repainted with a clean, professional finish. The metal gleamed. All the rust was gone. The locomotive looked new, but it also looked like what it had always been. It looked like a locomotive, but a better one. Margaret had made a test track nearby. It was only about 100 meters long, but it was enough to test the basic functions. She had repaired the old rails. She had prepared the track carefully. "Ready?" she asked Carlos. Carlos nodded. He looked nervous and excited at the same time. Margaret climbed into the locomotive. She had practiced this many times now, but it still felt significant. She understood all the systems. She knew how to operate it. She activated the startup sequence. The engine turned over. It was silent at first, just the sound of mechanisms engaging. Then the hybrid system engaged. The steam system combined with the battery power. The engine came alive. It sounded beautiful. Margaret guided the locomotive forward slowly. The metal wheels gripped the rails. The power transferred smoothly from the engine to the wheels. She accelerated gradually, testing each system, feeling the response of the machine. The locomotive moved down the track at a good speed. It was smooth. It was powerful. It was exactly what she had designed it to be. She brought it to a stop at the end of the test track and shut down the engine. She climbed out of the cabin and stood in front of Carlos and David. "It works," Carlos said. It was not a question. "Yes," Margaret said. "It works." She looked at the locomotive. She had done it. She had taken something old and broken and useless. She had transformed it into something new and powerful and beautiful. It had taken 6 months of work, but she had done it. The mockery did not matter now. The newspapers did not matter. What mattered was that she had created something impossible. What mattered was that this locomotive could prove what humans could do. In 2 weeks, the Krell would arrive on Earth for formal trade negotiations. Margaret had requested a demonstration. She had told the government she had something to show them. She had told them it would be important. Now, looking at the locomotive, she believed it. The transformation was complete. The real work was about to begin. The Krell delegation arrived at the railway yard on a morning full of clouds and wind. Their ship had landed near Riverfield, and they had traveled by ground vehicle to the location Margaret had specified. 3 of them came, dressed in clothing that seemed to shift colors depending on how the light hit it. The first was Coordinator Shen. He was tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished metal. His eyes were not like human eyes. They had multiple focuses, capable of seeing in different ways at the same time. He moved with a kind of mechanical precision, like every action was calculated and planned. The second was Protocol Officer Vex. Her body was different from Shen's. She had patterns on her skin that seemed to change color and shape as she communicated with the others. These patterns were language Margaret had learned. The Krell communicated through color shifts and patterns as much as through sound. The third was Junior Specialist Cole. He was younger, and his colors were brighter. He looked around the yard with what Margaret thought might be curiosity. He seemed more interested in observing than in judging, which made Margaret feel better. Margaret walked forward to greet them. She was nervous, but she did not show it. She had spent her career meeting important people and explaining complex technical ideas. This was not different, even though they were not human. "Welcome," she said. "Thank you for coming to see what we have created." Coordinator Shen responded through a translation device that hung from his body. His voice came out in clear English, though it had no emotion in it. "We have reviewed the specifications of your project," he said. "We do not understand the purpose. Your civilization abandoned steam locomotive technology 100 years ago. Your current propulsion systems are far more advanced. This project appears to be a waste of resources." Margaret had expected this response. She had known the Crow would not understand at first. "Please," she said, "let me show you what this locomotive can do. Then you can judge whether it is a waste of resources." She led them to the demonstration track. Margaret had spent weeks preparing. The track was more complex than the simple test track where she had first run the locomotive. This track had different challenges built into it. There were curves that required precise control. There were sections with different gradients. There were obstacles that the locomotive would need to navigate. Margaret climbed into the locomotive cabin. The Krell stood at various points along the track with observation equipment. They had brought devices to measure performance, to record data, to analyze what was happening. Margaret started the engine. The hybrid system engaged. The power built up gradually, controlled and smooth. She guided the locomotive forward. The machine moved down the track with precision and grace. The Krell equipment began recording data. Margaret could see lights on their devices as they collected information. She accelerated the locomotive carefully. The machine responded perfectly. The system she had designed worked exactly as she had planned. The locomotive was powerful and smooth. The wheels gripped the rails. The engine provided constant, reliable power. But this was just the beginning of what Margaret wanted to show them. As the locomotive approached the first curve, Margaret did something deliberate. She fed incorrect information to the guidance system. It was a test. She wanted to see if the locomotive could adapt and compensate. The locomotive systems detected the error instantly. The computer inside made calculations at high speed. It redistributed the power to the wheels. It adjusted the angle of the train slightly. It maintained speed through the curve without losing control or derailing. The Krell equipment recorded all of this. When Margaret brought the locomotive to a checkpoint, she could see the patterns on Vex's skin had shifted. Cole's eyes were focused intently on the locomotive. Margaret continued the demonstration. She pushed the locomotive harder. She fed it more challenges. She made sections of the track more difficult intentionally. At one point, she damaged a section of rail and programmed the locomotive to encounter it unexpectedly. The locomotive systems adapted. It recognized the damage. It redistributed weight. It slowed down slightly and adjusted power distribution to prevent damage to itself. It navigated the damaged section and continued. Margaret took the locomotive through increasingly complex scenarios. She had designed each one to show different capabilities. She demonstrated how the machine could learn from problems and adapt to them. She showed how the old technology of the locomotive, combined with new computer systems, could create something more capable than either could be alone. The most impressive part came when Margaret deliberately overloaded the system. She pushed the locomotive to 90% of its maximum capacity while navigating a complex section of track with multiple curves and a significant gradient. The engine screamed with power, but it did not fail. The systems worked together perfectly. The locomotive handled the challenge with strength and control. As Margaret brought the locomotive to a final stop in front of the Krell delegation, all three of them stood absolutely still. Vex's color patterns were moving rapidly. Shen's expression had not changed, but his sensors were pointed directly at the locomotive. Cole walked forward before the others could move. He approached the locomotive and touched it with his hand. His skin was warm, Margaret noticed. He looked up at her with his multiple eyes. "This is remarkable," he said in clear English. "This is not what we expected to observe." Margaret climbed down from the locomotive. She stood in front of the Krell delegation. "A locomotive is not the point," she said. "The locomotive is just an example. What I wanted to show you is how humans think. We do not throw away the old and build the new. We take what existed before and we improve it. We combine the old and the new. We refuse to accept that something is useless just because it is old." She pointed at the locomotive. "This machine uses technology from the 19th century combined with technology from the 21st century. In the hands of most engineers, this would be impossible. The systems would conflict. The old and new would not work together. But humans have a skill that comes from having limited resources. We have learned to make things work together, even when they seem different. We have learned to solve problems in creative ways. Coordinator Shen was silent for a long moment. Then he moved forward. He examined the locomotive carefully, looking at every detail. His sensors analyzed every system. When he was finished, he looked at Margaret directly. "What you have created is technically sophisticated," he said. "But there is something else here. Something we need to discuss with our government. Something that may be more valuable than advanced technology." Margaret felt something shift in that moment. She felt that something important was happening. She felt that the demonstration had worked. The Krell did not leave Earth immediately after the demonstration. Instead, they extended their stay. They requested meetings with Margaret. They requested access to her notes and designs. They wanted to understand how she had created the locomotive. More than that, they wanted to understand how humans thought. Margaret met with them in a conference room in the capital city. Coordinator Shen asked detailed questions about every decision she had made. Why had she chosen these materials? Why had she combined steam technology with battery systems? Why had she designed the adaptation protocols the way she had? Margaret answered every question carefully. She explained her reasoning. She talked about the limitations she had faced. She talked about how constraints had forced her to think creatively. She talked about how accepting that something was impossible was the death of progress. "On my world," Shen said, "when we identify technology that is outdated, we do not attempt to improve it. We discard it and design new systems from what we understand at the current time. This is more efficient. This is the logical approach. But what if your current systems have limitations you have not noticed?" Margaret asked. What if the problem requires thinking from a different time period? What if the solution exists in combining things you thought could not be combined? Vex's color patterns shifted. She communicated with Shen through color shifts and light patterns. Margaret could not understand the language, but she could see that this was important. "We have a project," Shen said finally. "A terraforming project on a world called Kepler 7. We have been attempting to create a stable atmosphere for 5 standard years. Our computer models say the project is impossible. Our engineers have created 3 different systems to solve the problem. None of them work. The constraints are too severe. The variables interact in ways our models cannot predict." He paused. "Your locomotive teaches us something important. It teaches us that limitation can be a teacher. It teaches us that old solutions combined with new approaches may solve what pure logic cannot solve." Margaret understood what he was saying. "You want humans to help," she said. "Yes," Shen said. "We want humans to help. We have technology far superior to yours. We have more resources. We have more knowledge about the galaxy. But there is something in how humans approach problems that we have lost. You see solutions where we see only constraints." Over the next 2 weeks, the Krell and Margaret developed a partnership plan. It was unprecedented. Humans would be brought into Krell research projects. Not as laborers or servants, but as partners. Humans would work alongside Krell, engineers on problems that the Krell alone could not solve. The announcement was made to governments around the world. It shocked everyone. Humanity was not going to be left behind as the Krell explored the galaxy. Humanity had something valuable to offer. Humanity had something the Krell needed. Kevin came to see Margaret when the news became public. He stood in her house looking embarrassed. He had been the one who had laughed the loudest. He had been the one who had mocked her the most. Now, his sister was meeting with aliens to form a partnership that would change the course of human history. "I was wrong," Kevin said simply. "I did not understand what you were doing." Margaret looked at her brother. "You were not wrong," she said. "You were limited in what you could understand. I was too. The Krell were limited too. That is the nature of being alive. We all have limits. The difference is whether we accept those limits as final or whether we use them as tools to think differently. Kevin nodded slowly. He understood, finally, that the demonstration of the locomotive had changed everything. But not in the way that Margaret had expected. She had wanted to prove that humans were not primitive. What had actually happened was more important. She had proved that humans were different. She had proved that humans had evolved in a way that made them valuable partners, not inferior servants. The news brought reporters back to the railway yard. Now, they wanted to celebrate Margaret instead of mocking her. They wanted to interview her. They wanted to understand her story. Margaret did most of her interviews standing next to the locomotive. Why did you believe in something that everyone said was impossible? One reporter asked what Margaret thought about this. Because I had spent my whole life doing impossible things, she said. I had worked in an industry dominated by men who did not want me there. I had designed engines that people said could never work. I had gone to school when people said women should not be engineers. I had failed many times and kept going. So when I looked at this locomotive, I did not see something impossible. I saw something that just required patience and creativity and the willingness to try. Another reporter asked what message she had for young people who wanted to be engineers. Margaret thought about this question for a long time. The message is that your limitations are not your weakness, she finally said. They are your strength. Humans are creative because we face limits. We are innovative because we have to be. We are adaptable because we have had to adapt. Do not be ashamed of limits. Use them. Let them teach you how to think differently. Within a month, humans were being recruited for Krell projects. Scientists, engineers, artists, farmers, and workers of all kinds. The Krell understood that they needed human creativity in all fields, not just engineering. The first team of human engineers was sent to Kepler-7 to work on the terraforming project. Carlos was one of them. He had learned from Margaret. He understood how to approach problems the way she did. He was chosen to lead the human team. Margaret was offered a position too. The Krell wanted her to work directly with their top engineers on their most advanced projects. She could travel the galaxy. She could see worlds she had never imagined. She could work on problems that would challenge her mind in new ways. But Margaret declined the offer. I am too old to travel the galaxy, she told Shen. What I can do is teach. I can teach other humans to think the way I think. I can help prepare humanity for this new role. I can make sure that we do not forget that our strength comes from accepting limits and finding creative solutions. Shen accepted this decision. He seemed to understand that Margaret knew what was right. Margaret stayed in Riverfield. She began teaching classes on engineering and creative problem solving. She worked with the government to develop programs that would prepare humans for partnership with the Krell. She mentored young engineers like Carlos had been mentored. She kept the locomotive. It became a monument and a teaching tool. Students came from around the world to see it. Teachers brought classes to look at it and understand the story of how it had changed the world. The mockery had stopped. The laughter had stopped. The doubt had stopped. What remained was respect. What remained was understanding. What remained was the knowledge that humans, despite being young and having limited technology, possess something that no amount of advanced technology could provide. Humans possessed adaptability. Humans possess the ability to see problems as challenges rather than as final barriers. Humans possess the gift of refusing to accept that anything was truly impossible. The first major project using human-Krell partnership took place on Kepler-7, a planet 17 light-years from Earth. The world had the right distance from its star. It had water. It had the basic chemistry needed to support life. But the atmosphere was toxic. The pressure was too high. The temperature swings were too extreme. The Krell had studied this planet for years and concluded it was too damaged to be terraformed using their existing technology. Carlos led the human team. With him were 10 other engineers, scientists, and problem solvers. They worked alongside Krell engineers led by a senior scientist named Jorth. Jorth had been working on Kepler-7 for 3 years without progress. He was frustrated and doubtful that the problem could be solved. The Krell approach had been logical and systematic. They had run thousands of computer simulations. They had calculated the optimal chemical compositions needed. They had designed systems to introduce the necessary elements into the atmosphere. But every solution they created caused new problems. Every system they designed created unexpected side effects that made the situation worse. Carlos studied the problem for 2 weeks before suggesting anything. He read all the Krell data. He understood their attempts. He understood why they had failed. Then he told Jorth something that shocked the Krell engineer. "Your solutions are too perfect," Carlos said. Jorth's color patterns shifted in confusion. "Explain," he said. "Your computer models are too precise," Carlos continued. "You have designed solutions that work perfectly in theory. But the real atmosphere of Kepler-7 is not behaving like your models predicted. Instead of making your solutions work, you should change your approach. Instead of trying to control every variable, you should work with the chaos. You should introduce elements that interact unpredictably and let the system find its own balance." This idea went against everything the Krell had learned. In Krell science, control was essential. Precision was required. To introduce variables that could not be predicted seemed insane, but Jorth was desperate. The project had failed repeatedly. He decided to trust Carlos. They changed their approach completely. Instead of trying to control the atmosphere, they introduced biological elements that had been modified to survive harsh conditions. They created organisms that could process the toxic chemicals. They allowed these organisms to interact with the environment in ways that could not be fully predicted or controlled. The results were remarkable. Within weeks, the atmosphere began to change. Not according to any computer model, but in ways that were actually better than the models had predicted. The organisms adapted to their environment faster than expected. They created new compounds that helped improve the atmosphere further. The system was self-correcting and self-improving. Within 3 months, the toxic elements had been reduced significantly. Within 6 months, the atmosphere had transformed so much that humans could walk outside with simple breathing masks instead of full spacesuits. Within 1 year, Kepler-7 had a breathable atmosphere. The Krell celebrated, but Jorth's celebration was different. He approached Carlos and said something that had never been said in his 1,000-year history with other civilizations. "You have taught me how to think differently," he said. "This is more valuable than any technology." The success on Kepler-7 changed everything for human-Krell relations. Suddenly, every Krell research project wanted to include humans. Every Krell scientist wanted to understand how humans solved problems. The demand for human partners far exceeded the supply. Governments on Earth formed councils to coordinate which humans would go to which projects. Universities began special programs to train humans specifically for working with the Krell. The pay was incredible. The opportunities were beyond anything humans had imagined. Young people lined up to apply for the programs. Engineers, scientists, artists, teachers, workers of all kinds. They saw this as an opportunity to make a difference, to work on problems that mattered, to be part of something bigger than Earth. But not everyone celebrated. Some people feared that humans were being used by the Krell. Some people said humans should not trust aliens. Some people said that humans should focus on solving Earth's problems before helping other worlds. There were protests. There were arguments. There were debates in governments around the world. Margaret watched all of this from her home in Riverfield. She gave interviews about what she thought. She said that humans had always learned from doing things. She said that working with the Krell would teach humanity things that would help Earth too. She said that humans had the chance to grow and to be part of something bigger than themselves. One person who disagreed with Margaret was a scientist named Dr. Patricia Wheeler. She was famous for environmental work on Earth. She gave a speech saying that Margaret was wrong. She said that humans should not be exported to other worlds until Earth was fixed. She said that helping other planets when people on Earth were suffering was immoral. Margaret asked for a meeting with Dr. Wheeler. They met in a coffee shop in Washington, D.C. Margaret was 60 now. She had gray hair and lines on her face from decades of work and sun. Dr. Wheeler was younger, maybe 50, with intense eyes and a forceful way of speaking. "I understand your concern," Margaret told her, "but I think you are looking at this wrong. The Krell are not taking humans away. They are offering us knowledge. When humans work on Kepler-7 and learn how to solve atmospheric problems, we bring that knowledge back to Earth. We use it to fix our own environment. The partnership is not taking from Earth. It is giving to Earth." Dr. Wheeler was quiet for a moment. "Can you guarantee that?" she asked. "No," Margaret said honestly. "I can't guarantee anything. Nothing is guaranteed in life. But I believe it is true. And I believe that refusing to learn from others because we are afraid is never the right choice." Dr. Wheeler eventually came around to Margaret's way of thinking. She even became an advocate for the partnership, though she insisted that Earth's environmental problems be addressed simultaneously with other projects. Over the next 2 years, the Human-Krell partnership grew stronger. 7 different projects were underway. Humans were learning from the Krell, but more importantly, the Krell were learning from humans. The Krell civilization began to change. They became less rigid. They became more adaptable. They started to question some of their basic assumptions about what was possible and what was not. And it had all started with an old woman who bought a broken locomotive and refused to listen to people who said it was impossible. Margaret sometimes sat in her backyard and thought about how strange life was. She had spent 40 years designing spacecraft engines. She had worked in the most advanced fields of human technology, but her most important work had not come from that advanced knowledge. It had come from her willingness to look at something old and see possibility in it. It had come from her belief that constraints and limitations could be teachers. The governments of Earth offered her medals and honors. Universities wanted to name buildings after her. Young people wanted autographs. Margaret accepted these things with kindness, but they did not matter much to her. What mattered was that humans and Krell were working together. What mattered was that the partnership was changing both civilizations. What mattered was that people were learning to see obstacles as opportunities instead of as final barriers. The locomotive still sat in the yard in Riverfield. Margaret had it maintained carefully. It had not been run in a long time, but it sat there, visible to anyone who passed, a symbol of what one person could create when they refused to believe that anything was impossible. Sometimes Margaret's students from her engineering classes asked her why she did not run the locomotive anymore. "Because it has done its work," she would tell them. The locomotive was never really about transportation. It was about showing what humans could do. Now other projects are doing that work. The locomotive can rest and be a reminder. Margaret's teaching classes became the most famous engineering program in the world. Young people came from every country to study with her. She taught them not just engineering, but how to think. She taught them how to use their constraints as tools. She taught them that being limited was not a weakness. It was a starting point for creativity. One day, a young woman named Lisa, came to one of Margaret's classes. Lisa was from Tokyo. She was studying to be an engineer for the Krell Partnership. She asked Margaret a question. How did you know it would work? How did you know the locomotive would change everything? Margaret thought about this. She had asked herself this question many times. I did not know it would work, Margaret finally said. I only knew that I had to try. I knew that humans had something special. I knew that if I could show that something special to the world, it might change things. And I was willing to fail trying. That is the real secret. Not believing you will succeed, but being willing to fail in pursuit of something you believe in. 3 years after the initial demonstration, the locomotive was officially designated as a historical monument. The government created a museum around it. The building was modern and impressive, but the locomotive was the center of everything. It sat on restored tracks inside a climate-controlled space. Light shone on it, highlighting every detail. Margaret stood in the museum one day, looking at the locomotive she had built. She was 61 now. Her hair was completely gray. Her back sometimes hurt from decades of work, but her mind was still sharp. The director of the museum, a woman named Susan, stood beside her. We have had 50,000 visitors in the past month alone, Susan said. People come from all over Earth. The Krell bring groups too. They want to understand the story. Margaret nodded. She had known the locomotive would become important, but she had not expected this level of attention. Can I ask you something? Susan said. Do you ever regret it? Do you ever wish you had just enjoyed your retirement instead of taking on this project? Margaret considered the question carefully. No, she said finally. I do not regret it. This project gave me purpose when I thought my life was finished. I was going to live out my final years doing nothing important. The locomotive gave me the chance to do something that mattered. The museum held classes and lectures. Teachers brought students from schools around the world to learn about Margaret and the locomotive. The story had become legend. Children studied it in their history classes. It was taught alongside major events in human history. The narrative had shifted over time. Now people talked about the locomotive not as the crazy project of an old woman, but as the moment when humanity changed its place in the galaxy. Some people said it was as important as the first human spaceflight. Some people said it was as important as any invention in human history. Kevin visited the museum with his family. His grandchildren looked at the locomotive with wonder. They had learned about it in school. They did not know their great-aunt as the woman everyone had mocked. They knew her as the woman who had changed everything. Kevin walked with Margaret through the museum. He pointed out a section dedicated to the first human Krell research projects. There were photographs and data about the Kepler-7 terraforming. There were explanations of how human creativity combined with Krell technology had solved problems that neither civilization could solve alone. I think about how I laughed at you, Kevin said. I think about how I brought people to mock you. I cannot believe I was so blind. Margaret put her hand on her brother's shoulder. You were not blind, she said. You were like everyone else. You could not see what I could see because you had not lived the life I had lived. You had not spent decades doing difficult things. You had not learned that the impossible is just another word for something that takes longer to accomplish. The museum director asked Margaret if she would do a public presentation about the locomotive. Margaret agreed. They set it up for a weekend afternoon. Margaret stood in front of a large audience. Some people were there in person. Many more watched through video connection from other countries and other worlds. Krell representatives attended the presentation too. One of them was Coordinator Shen, who had witnessed the original demonstration. Another was Jorth, the Krell engineer who had learned to think differently on Kepler-7. They were younger, Krell scientists who had worked on various human Krell projects. Margaret spoke about the locomotive simply and directly. I built this machine because I believed humans were not understood, she said. The Krell came to Earth and saw a young civilization with limited technology. They were not wrong about that. We are young. Our technology is not as advanced as theirs. But what the Krell did not understand at first was that humans have something that goes beyond technology. We have the ability to adapt. We have the ability to take what exists and improve it. We have the ability to see problems as puzzles to solve instead of as proof that something cannot be done. She paused and looked directly at the audience. This locomotive is not important because it is a good locomotive, she continued. It is important because it is a message. The message is that humans will not accept limits as final. The message is that when humans face obstacles, we find ways around them, or through them, or over them. The message is that humans are creative because we have had to be creative. Humans are adaptable because we have had to adapt. Margaret walked over to the locomotive and put her hand on it. The metal was cool and smooth. Every human who has had a good idea that other people said was impossible should look at this machine and remember that the impossible is just another name for something that requires more work, she said. Every human who feels limited should remember that limitations are teachers. Every human who wants to help the galaxy should remember that what the galaxy needs from humanity is not more advanced technology. What the galaxy needs is our creativity, our adaptability, our refusal to give up. The presentation was recorded and shared across human networks and with the Krell civilization. It became one of the most watched videos in human history. People watched it when they were facing difficult problems. Teachers showed it to students who were struggling with challenges. Parents showed it to children who said that something was too hard. Margaret's fame continued to grow, but she stayed in Riverfield. She continued teaching her classes. She continued mentoring young engineers. She continued to be available to anyone who wanted to talk to her about problems or challenges. Carlos visited Earth for the first time in 3 years. He had been working on multiple terraforming projects with the Krell. He had become the most respected human engineer in the partnership. When he saw Margaret, he embraced her like a son would embrace his mother. I have been thinking about what you taught me, Carlos said. Every project I work on, I remember what you said about constraints being teachers. I remember the locomotive. It helps me solve problems. It helps me think differently. Margaret was proud of Carlos. She was proud of all the humans who had gone into the partnership and who were doing good work. She was proud that her work had contributed to that. 5 years after the demonstration, the Krell formally asked for Earth to become a full member of the Galactic Council. This was unprecedented. Humans had existed in space for less than 70 years. Most civilizations waited thousands of years before gaining council membership. But the Krell had become advocates for humanity. They argued that humans had already proven their value through their partnerships. They argued that denying Earth membership would be refusing to recognize humanity's contributions. The vote was close, but humanity was granted membership. For the first time, humans had a voice in galactic affairs. Young people from Earth were recruited to work in government roles across the galaxy. Human ideas and perspectives began to influence how the galaxy was managed. None of this would have happened without the locomotive. Margaret was invited to the Galactic Council opening. She chose not to go. Instead, she sat in her home and watched the ceremony through video. She saw humans standing among aliens, contributing their ideas, making decisions that affected worlds and civilizations. It was enough. On Margaret's birthday that year, the town of Riverfield held a celebration. They closed the main street and decorated it with lights. They gave speeches about Margaret's contribution to human civilization. They named the local school after her. They installed a statue of her in the town square.